I think we're ready to get started. If everyone will find a seat, it's good to see everybody. Glad y'all are all here today for our noon lecture. And we actually have two speakers speaking today. Dr. Stan Galicki, well, really both of these speakers have many, many years of experience, well over 30 years each, and extensive publication record. They've worked in academia and out of academia, but both have been professors for many, many years. Dr. Stan Galicki received a BS degree from Wittenberg University, a master's from the University of Memphis, and a PhD from the University of Mississippi. And he is now a professor of geology at Millsaps. Dr. Daryl Smits received a BS from Mississippi State University and a master's from University of Mississippi and a PhD from Texas A&M University. So two honored speakers today that we're very excited to have. Now, according to their information, Mississippi's been smashed together, torn apart, inundated by oceans, weathered and eroded, yet clues to the rock record enable this history to be interpreted. And this history, the geologic history of Mississippi, was created over millions of years, but it only took 10 years to put this book together. So they're going to talk about their book, The Roadside Geology of Mississippi. So please welcome. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I'm Daryl Schmitz, and I'm going to start off with what went into actually making the book, so they'll give you a little background. And although it took about 10 years to make the book, I'll have to say it was actually longer than that I was originally contacted at a Geological Society meeting about doing it. I said yes, and then just forgot about it for a while. But then in the meantime, I actually started writing the roads to make road logs to make the book. And about that time, Stan came up and says, "Oh, you're doing Roadside. I wanted to do that." And I thought about it, and I said, "Well, why don't you join me and let's co-author it, because otherwise it's never going to get done. I need something to push me on out." So we did, and in the process, I suggested he take the leadership on that book because it was someone had to deal with Mountain Press, and I thought maybe I can get him to do that. And that kind of worked out. So worked out pretty nice. Well, so the task to get the book itself done and looking at the geology course, but got to identify what roads are incorporated, look at how we break it up in regions, because if you've seen the book, it's kind of region-based. Travel those roads, compile the text once all that's done, edit it, and then finally, of course, publish it. Identify and select roads and regions. So road selection, first thing, take a look at it is a road map, and then look at some criteria and some roads that are selected. So most everybody's kind of familiar with the basic road map in Mississippi, and there's roads all over the place, all kinds of state roads. So which ones are we going to go with? So that's sort of the criteria part. And what we ended up doing is looking at what needed to go in there. The publisher kind of specifies certain ones, and what they kind of specified was federal roads, interstates, U.S. highways if they're not paralleling, or if they have something very unique on them, at least if they are paralleling an interstate. Primary state roads, and then we put in some other state roads because there are some situations where, such as a scenic loop perhaps, or something like that had something important, or perhaps a road going to something we ended up including in the book. So those were kind of the criteria. The federal road, the reason that's in there, some states may not even have this, but type of criteria, but we have the Natchez Trace, and that's a federal road, so that's why it was included. So we selected the roads based on these criteria. The other roads portion, what we kind of ended up looking at was saying some of these state roads are not considered primary, but finally kind of arrived at if it's a state road that directly connects two of our cities that are about 10,000 population or higher, we pretty much included them as criteria to make those state roads. And there are some other ones that didn't fit that criteria, but are sort of heavily traveled for some purpose, such as, Highway 19 out of Meridian going to Philadelphia. A lot of traffic there, so we included a few like that. And this was our first cut, and you can kind of see the different roads incorporated with that criteria. Okay. So we got the road selected. Now we need to look at the different regions and that we're going to break the state into and how we're going to do that. So we look at the geologic map, physiographic map, the criteria then to make that breakup and actually set those regional boundaries. Well, geologic map of the state, this is one a lot of you are familiar with, and some of you have cards, I think, with the basic one on it right now. So it shows the geology of the state, the basic ones, and there's some differences obviously in the geology. And I put this on here. This is the one I actually used a lot during the traveling of the roads. However, you'll notice there are no roads on this particular map, right? I'll come back to that in a minute. And physiographic. Now, back in the day, I started with this physiographic map, although there's a much more recent one with newer terminology in the book. And the reason I started with this one, this was the one I was educated on at Mississippi State, and I still had it. So it's like, okay, I remember this one, so I'm going to use it to make my first cuts. And those physiographic divisions are really controlled by the geologic units that underlie them. You can start seeing some of the similarities just jumping back and forth. So what's the criteria of making these regional breakups? We looked at, they wanted normally for our size state, about 4 kind of major divisions within the state, similar geology, similar physiography. So kind of using that information, we went, to the regional boundaries, so I skipped a bit, which this was there again, the first cut, and again using the physiographic boundaries is kind of make that break. A northeast Mississippi, a central Mississippi, a coastal Mississippi, and a western Mississippi. And the reason being is that the materials involved, the geology is somewhat similar to the north in the central. Coastal's a little different, and the western's a little different. So back up a second, I guess, and point out. The western part is the Mississippi River floodplain, alluvium, and the Lurse deposits. They're adjacent to it. Northeast Mississippi has some similarity of hills and prairies. Central Mississippi has some hills and prairies, and then the coastal zone has some terraces and recent deposits. So that was kind of the original cut to break it down. So the next thing to do is travel the roads and start putting together road logs to be able to actually come up with the book. And the first road log I actually did and started on was 2002. It was about 2006 to 7 when Stan came on and said, we got to move on this thing, and I started really in earnest getting out there and traveling those roads. The other thing I'll say at this point, when I agreed to do this way back, and when we first started work on it together, it was a 3-color book, black, white, and red. Okay. And also the photographs were black and white, which at the time, a 2-megapixel image was fine. So I was carrying around an old Sony, I think it was, that you put the small floppy disk in and take digital pictures with. It was color, but it was 2 megapixels, and that was fine. We'll talk about that again in a minute. Oops, it's jumping on me here. Yeah, so, image of traveling. And it's not wise to try driving and try working on maps and plotting and stuff all at the same time. Okay, texting and driving is bad enough. Okay, try reading maps and writing stuff all at the same time. So I got students involved to help drive while I did the other stuff. And this is one of the students that helped out. I had, I think, about 5 or 6, and my wife. I should not leave my wife out. She did some driving also. She'll tell you her favorite 2 stories, one of which is when I said, stop on top of this bridge on the interstate, and she didn't like that idea. The other one, we had a couple visiting us, and we're traveling down to New Orleans, and in doing so, I said I'd pick up part of 61 South from Natchez, and we're going along, there's a nice sand outcrop somewhere along through there, so I said, stop, because I need to take a look at it. She stopped it. She knew by then that stop meant stop right then. Our 2 guests were on the floorboard in the back seat. But, and those students and my wife are credited as in acknowledgments in there. So what am I doing while I'm traveling? Road logs. I'm making locations, distances, and also when I started this, I could have GPS probably, but that wasn't really the way these books are set up, and so they talk about mileage and things, so I didn't GPS at the time, at least. Maps of various type. I have road maps. We have some geologic maps, so I have geology, any kind of exposure. I probably had, 400 photographs to start out with. Anything that was exposed on the side of the road, I took a picture of it, because better to have too much, and indeed we did edit a lot of those out, and some of them went away. but it was better to have too many than not enough. Taking photos of those, other things related to geology, and anything else that might be relevant of interest. Okay, there's my field notebooks. I started out with the one on the left, which is actually the one I had in my summer geology field camp. Still had space in it, and so I said I'll use it up. Went to the next one, and I thought that's all I would need. I was wrong. And so going down the road one day, I realized I was running out and had to go into Walmart or something and get the one on the right. And there was actually a couple of those. So, and what they look like. And remember, I am a doctor. Not a medical doctor, but it doesn't matter. You can see my chicken scratch. Okay, so various things on there, dates, who's driving, what vehicle I'm in, because I wasn't sure all the time that the mileage counts on the vehicles might be accurate. So on this day, starting down here, I-55 North, Toyota, and that one I actually was by myself. Okay, the interstate, a good bit of the interstate is so well covered that there's not much that I can take a picture of and note exposure. But most of the time I had someone driving with me. How did I know what roads I had traveled and when I got them written up? Because there's a whole bunch of them. So I used this system of hatchering the light yellow highlighting to start with of the roads to be traveled. When I traveled them, I kind of did the hatchering on them. As I wrote the road logs up, I did the orange highlighting to say it's done. First cut's done. So, and then there was original breaks in physiography on here too. Now, when we ended up publishing that book out, the decision was made to use the interstate system to make that breakout because they closely aligned with those areas, and it made it much easier to describe rather than stopping an interstate 10 miles north of Jackson or something. Didn't make sense. So another thing that actually was very useful was the gazetteer. I can't say that. And it was actually helpful in many aspects. And one thing we did, and a good example is here at Woodville going into the Clear Creek recreational area, I tried to use distance away from our roads for something of interest. And I tried to limit that to about 7 miles or so out and not go too much farther. There are a couple of places I included, one of which I think we may have kept. Anyway, that were a little bit farther than that. This is one of them, but it's so spectacular we felt like it needed to be in there, and indeed it's there. And there was one or two other ones, but otherwise I would look at them within about 7 miles off the major roads. Of course, the geology. You have to note the geology. And back to the geologic map, and because the roads weren't on the other one, thanks to working at the survey many years ago, I found that I still had one of these overlays of the map roads. Now, that's roads from, the 1960s or 70s, but at least a lot of them were still there, a lot of them were still very close, and it created what I needed driving those roads. So this stayed in my home office as you see it for a few years. And it's now in my game room, just like that. Okay. Geologic bulletins, particularly the county bulletins, were extremely useful, and occasionally some specific ones like the history of the Vicksburg National Military Park, to put the information, pull it out, look at it. A lot of this stuff is kind of known. Generally speaking, I knew about it, but I also knew where I could go get information to make sure what I said was right, or should be right at least. So the geologic bulletins, and not just the county ones. There were at least 3, I think, of the road ones: Highway 25, Highway 16, Highway 80, Highway 45. So there are 4 of those out there, and those were still useful. There again, those were the old U.S. highways, and now we've got interstate systems paralleling them, but they're still very, very useful in trying to do this specific work. One example I wanted to pull out to show was Adams County down around Natchez. And it has several, this is one of the geologic maps showing the geology. It showed, that was the old map. Here's the newer map in the environmental series bulletin. So sometimes there was more than one resource of maps to take a look at. And sometimes they don't always necessarily agree either. And the Mississippi Delta. On our state map, for example, that's all alluvium. But the Corps of Engineers has mapped it in much more detail of backswap deposits, point bar deposits, abandoned channels in the blue. So we use that to bring some of that detail into the book also. So tried to find as much existing data as possible. And I would have this like in the car with me, traveling, looking for these features as I traveled so I could note what that mileage was when I crossed them, to put it in there. The coast, similarly, geologic work from the survey and with a researcher down at the coast had put out a little more detail. We have even more detail today, but at the time, not quite as much, and that was, again, very useful. Okay, so we got the basic geology involved. Then the actual exposures of any of this as it traveled, and everybody is familiar with our just vast amount of rock outcrops in this state, right? Not very many. So where there was some, this is one of the more famous ones going into Meridian, I took pictures. And as I said, if there was a small spot on the side of the road where something was exposed, I took a picture of it, okay, and noted what it should be and that type of thing. Many of these, like I said, we did, and I knew we would discard. I had way too many, but having some and then discarding was the best way to go. Maybe that would be a good place to also note that, now we'll come back to that in a second. Other areas of relevant interest, okay? Things like, since I'm Mississippi State, and we have a museum dedicated to geology at Mississippi State, that's noted in there so that people, if they want to stop by and check it out, they can. This museum is noted in there also, and other places of specific interest, such as Clark Creek Natural Area. That's noted because it's of interest, and it's of interest because it has something like, was it 30 or 50 waterfalls in that area, just tremendous amount of waterfalls, which you would think in Mississippi that waterfalls, okay, but they're there and they're quite impressive for Mississippi particularly. Now, the National Military Park in Vicksburg was another specific point of interest that we played in there, and because of the Lurs deposits and the Civil War battle there, and the Lurs had a lot to do with the whole setup of Vicksburg, why there's a bluff, why the river is no longer where it's at, but was such a gauntlet at the time, why there were caves, why the Confederates built their forts out of earth, the Lurs material, and how that worked. And that a lot of these are still standing. You can see them today, as well as trenches that were dug in that Lurs still stand today. Tunnels, you can still see them. And the top left is kind of what it looked like at that point in time, which you ever get a chance, if you hadn't been, it makes a big difference. When I was young growing up, I went to the park and I could understand why there was a red sign and here's a blue sign and there were trees everywhere. Well, they cleared some of that out so you can see kind of what was going on at the time, and it makes a big difference. And I think we actually have a statement noting this, but I actually took pictures of all these monuments for the different states put in there because a lot of the states used a native stone from their state to build those monuments. Okay, so that statement is kind of noted in the book. I think it got stated, but the pictures we didn't keep all going. And of course, the Lurs overlaying the pre-Lurs deposits there in the Vicksburg area were important. So we pulled a lot of that in there. Okay, so I've traveled the roads, I've gotten the geology, I've taken pictures, and now compile the text. And so this is our first cut that Stan worked up for our kind of cover. And doing that, background and general part for the book, which Stan put all that together for us. And then the regions, I put the first cut together and Stan edited it, and then went to Mountain Press, and we'll see that. Here's the first cut of the outline as we put it together. No page numbers yet, just the order, the things we're going to include. This is some of Stan's work in the first part of the first cut at the first chapter. Just going to kind of go through it so you can see what it looked like in those first cuts. A lot of important geology in the state, including some of the changes in the offshore islands. And then compiling the text for the regions. Here's an example of that first one, Northeast Mississippi, and Stan did the cross-section for it down here in GIS. I wrote the original write-up, which was pretty cumbersome and detailed. Stan made it look better. And some of the photos that we got kept in there, such as a view of the Verstone Cuesta. And this was the original photos too, those 2 megapixel color ones. Then the edits. Also, we now go to full color book, no longer 3 color. A 2 megapixel photo is no longer acceptable for the color photos now instead of black and white. So after the editing process of getting down those 400 pictures down to 150 or so, then we had to go back and retake all those. And in that process, our first round of that turned out not to work for whatever reason. Stan went and got a camera. I borrowed my wife's iPad because my iPhone wasn't good enough, and those seemed to work. work out. So we had to retake photos basically twice at the end. But the type editing, the normal sidebar that the editor from Mountain Press did and Stan did, mine are yellow highlighted. Okay. We also wrote the final. This is the proof now. The proof, you don't do that. The proof, you write on it, whatever you think is an issue. So we got to the proofs. Let's see, I think yours is in purple, mine's in blue, or something like that. So we did that. And it's published. And there it is. And so for my portion, I'll ask if there are any questions before we move on to Stan's portion, which will be more fun. Yes?
Did you keep the total mileage that you covered, including the reshoots?
No. I don't want to know. I'm sure I crossed the U.S. more than once. All right.
Advance, I think I can figure it out. Okay. Okay, I'll wait till we'll get this queued up, but looking at some of those edits it just made me shudder. I was so tired of talking to my editor. And it wasn't his fault. He was doing what he was supposed to do, and he really did a very good job, but it was always so interesting to me what they wanted in the book and what they wanted me to take out of the book. And so I'd have to go to Daryl, and he'd say, "Well, I really want that in." And I say, "Okay, I'll go back to him and see what we can do." But yeah, when we first started talking, I thought, how hard could this be? The drawings are 3-color line drawings, and I thought that should be easy. As soon as we signed the contract, they let us know that they went to full color, high resolution. So that means every figure I drew had to be in full color and high resolution. So you'll see the results, but in the end, I think it worked out. I don't think I would have wanted to do what Daryl did on this book, and I don't think he would want to do what I did on this book. So it was really a perfect team. How many know what this picture is? Yeah. This, I know you know, George. What is it?
Well, actually, I may have gotten it wrong. This looks like that 1930s photograph, famous one, of the petrified forest.
It is. This is what the petrified forest looked like in 1931 when National Geographic came and photographed it. And it looks, and I couldn't use this in the book. It was too grainy, and actually, even though National Geographic had no record of it, they wouldn't give me permission to use it. So I had to leave it out, but of course, if you've ever been to the petrified forest, it does not look like this right now. And so fortunately, that was saved and from erosion, and just an amazing photograph right there. So roadside geology in Mississippi, huh? Daryl kind of approached this, and what is that? I very quickly learned that any exposure that's not overgrown, eroded, or graded and seeded by MDOT was something that could serve as a potential target for the book. And so we went with that. Well, then, about a year later, I was talking to one of our guests in the room today, David Dockery, and he reminded me that the best geology in Mississippi is not visible from the road. And I had to acknowledge, I said, "David, I understand that, but I have to write the book anyway." And that's what presented some of the challenges that we don't have. We have some very exciting outcrops once you get to know them, but the geology is very subtle. But that didn't mean that the geologic history of Mississippi is boring, because it isn't. So when I started writing the introduction, I wanted to make sure that people understood that geologically Mississippi is quite complex, and we've been involved in several continental collisions, and we've been torn apart many times, and so hopefully that comes across in the book. Let's see. I'm having some issues here. Can you advance that from there? Oh, point it up there? Good, thank you. So in the end, 271 pages, 82 figures. Those are all drawn using CorelDRAW, and we ended up taking 115 photos. And these things called sidebars are just what Daryl said. They are places of interest that were perhaps off the road, that we just thought we had to include in the book. And if people wanted to go there, they could, but it wasn't necessarily on the roads that were selected. So again, the sections, the introduction, Northeast, the Delta, Southeastern, and coastal Mississippi. And these are all figures from the book that you'll see now. So in Mississippi, the red are the rocks that we have exposed at the surface in Mississippi. And then, of course, you can see the rest of the geological timescale. Very, very small amount of Earth history is preserved at the surface, but that is what we were working with. And in the introduction, I wanted to make sure that people were aware that there is much more to Mississippi beneath the surface. This was the final map that we ended up with, and I have to give credit to the guys at the State Bureau because some of the changes I incorporated into this map are work that they did for the lignite industry that came in. There are some changes there that don't appear on the state geological maps yet, and I'm sure they'll work those in, but tried to get in some of the most current geology. They're constantly mapping all the time, but getting those maps out to publish is sometimes more difficult. So this is, it's very similar, but you can see, you can see that there's some variance up in here for the nanophilia, some of the units where that became important when lignite companies were interested in those deposits in Mississippi. So that changed the geologic map considerably. And so this is what we came up with. Then what do the actual figures look like? Again, the integration of road maps and geology. This is just some of the samples. When I sent, if we look back, when I sent the editor my map, the first thing I did is I sat down, and there are certain colors you're supposed to use for the United States Geological Survey. And I started putting these colors down, and how am I going to do this? And so I started recording all the red, green, blue coding for these, and I sent it to my editor. He said, "What is this?" I said, "Have you seen the map?" And so he pretty much, with very little editing, these were the colors that we went with. And so again, different maps. You can see the sidebars are these red squares. So I do talk about the Ross Barnett Reservoir, LaFleur's Bluff State Park, the Red Hot Fossil Stop, the Bashai Boulders, anything that is of great interest that we thought people would like to know about. These are some of the delta, again, incorporating some of that information that Daryl talked about, although you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference when you're driving across the delta. There are scientists from the Corps that knew, and so these are incorporated in the book as well. Delo Water Park, and then, of course, the coast. Some interesting features down Campbell and Point Clear Islands. Just some really neat places in the state, certainly many that I wasn't even aware of. And so it was quite an education for me. I was able to let my editor, he let me keep this photo in. This is actually the physiographic provinces superimposed on a digital elevation model of the state that I was able to get from Maris. And I like it because it shows the extensive stream erosion and that takes place in the state and how extensive those streams are. And he said they had never incorporated one before. I said, well, why not now? And so he let it stay. This is a map that was produced by our state geological survey, and just to show the structural features that are present throughout Mississippi. We talk about these breakups. So there have been at least 3 supercontinents that have broken up over the past 800 million years: Rodinia, Panotia, and Pangaea most recently. and in the geological history, I try to put together, kind of take the reader through time and how did Mississippi come to be where it is today. Some figures in the introduction talking about the oil and gas exploration in the state. We have, the Black Warrior Basin here, which is very different from the interior Salt Basin, the lower Wilcox and Tuscaloosa play, and then a little bit of production down here in South Mississippi. And so, again, oil and gas has been a big part of our geological history, as well as salt domes. Again, most of these are just reproductions of state geological survey maps, but to be consistent, they had to all be redrafted and brought into something coherent that would tie to the book. One of my favorites that I think I knew nothing about was Project Salmon and Project Sterling that happened in the 1960s. That blast chamber, which was Project Salmon, was created by a nuclear blast. They drilled a hole, they put a nuclear bomb in the hole, and they exploded it. Then Project Sterling, they exploded another one inside that chamber to see how the Earth responded to those seismic waves. And I know there's a picture in one of the bulletins of Michael Bograd, I think, and somebody else standing in front of the plaque that's there now. Of course, I think all those people are supplied, that nobody drinks well water there anymore. But that was quite a big deal. But I really enjoyed learning about the Tatum Salt Dome and its history. This, I knew this had to be in the book. This is an incredible cross-section that was, again, originally created by our people at the State Geological Survey. This runs from North Mississippi, along the eastern boundary of the state. That line is tied together. I didn't put them in, but there are numerous. All this control is based on oil wells. And so they use the electric logs from those oil wells to create this. And of course, I had to do some editing to it. I couldn't incorporate as much detail as there is on the state's map. But again, that is an incredible piece of work that we felt had to be in the book. Then you will see several panels that they are given a geologic time period and then kind of a paleogeographic map of what is happening, what we think, again, what's interpreted to have happened during that time. And so this is not, the colors are different. These are just the ones that I created, and then my editor just changed the colors, which is fine. But this is the Alabama-Oklahoma transform, which was tearing. Mississippi has always been on the coast, as far back as you can go. We were situated on the coast, but either being torn apart or smashed back together again. A prominent feature, if you look at a geologic map of the U.S. and then Mississippi, is this feature we call the Mississippi embayment. And you can see how all the rocks take this large bend. If you follow the colors around the geologic map, you see that if we could remove the alluvium from the Mississippi River, they would all come out over here in southern Arkansas. Well, that Mississippi embayment is part of the history of that previous slide. And so that the Mississippi River flows down, and that embayment is part of a weak zone in the crust that was created back 700 million years ago. And so the reason the Mississippi River flows where it is because of that weakness in the crust. And here is what it looks like. The sediment have pushed down that weak zone in the crust, that graben, and filled in over time. This is the Mississippi River alluvial sediment that's roughly 10,000 years old. And then this is what it looks like along the axis of the embayment. So you get considerably deeper as you move southward out of Arkansas and down into Louisiana. And again, we move through time. Back when South America pushed in, we had a mountain chain This is a little early, but after the Mississippian, we had a mountain chain between here and Memphis that rivals the Himalayas. It's gone now, but yet it was here. Part of what we saw, though, during just before that collision finalized, there's an interpretation of some barrier islands in Alabama, and I actually should have drawn one more here because we've got one in Mississippi, and that's the Hartzell Sandstone, which you see in Tishomingo State Park. That's a Mississippian age barrier island is the interpretation. So a wonderful place to visit. You can see this right off the trace, and then of course you can go into the park and see Jean's overhang and walk through the park, and that's a sidebar in the text. This, one of the greatest earth-moving endeavors that humans have ever undertaken, 304 million tons of rock. The history of this goes back, people that were traveling the Tennessee River wanted to get to the Gulf ever since discoverers came into this area. But you can see the Hartzell Sandstone here, and again, they had to cut through many outcrops to make that the Tennessee-Tombigbee waterway happen. Here is again, ultimately during the Pennsylvanian period, we're looking at the final stages of the collision, the last collision, before we moved into the more modern breakup of Pangaea 200 million years ago. Again, all of this is in the subsurface. This is all geological history based on seismic records and oil and gas, and so I would just go through the literature and find kind of the current hypotheses as to what these areas looked like, but again, it's not been put together in a publication before. Again, one of the curious things in Mississippi is not only the Jackson Dome, but also what happened in the Upper Cretaceous in the deposition of all the chalk that we have across the state. So beneath Jackson, this was a wonderful cross-section that I modified from Steve Walkinshaw, and shows the configuration of the Jackson Dome. And then during that time, again, while we had those volcanic islands and activity, the deposition of the chalk. This is up near Starkville. And so wonderful outcrops of the chalk when you can see it. A great place to take kids and collect shells and pyrite and everything else. We move into the Paleocene. Tremendous deltas coming down through the delta, through the Mississippi. Lots of sediment being brought down. With that sediment, here you see the outcrops on the way to Meridian. And I was just told today that they've done some work on these, and they're not even as... they were truly impressive when they were first cut, but I didn't think these things would ever go away. But they've done some work on them recently, I'm told, and cut them back a little bit more. And then the lignite deposits that we have. This is a view of the Red Hills lignite mine up in Ackerman County. If you want, as far as I know, you can still take field trips up there. Wonderful place to visit if you've not been there. Darrell worked on the hydrology in the inception of the Red Hills lignite mine, and probably has wonderful stories, but it truly is a great place to visit if you haven't been there. We move into the Eocene, and of course, anybody that lives in central Mississippi is aware that the state fossil is a whale that lived during that time period. This is the one that's out hanging in the hall here, courtesy of the museum. But we also had the Yazoo clay, and as bad as the Yazoo clay is, I guess it gave us the whales. But this is an outcrop on Lakeland Drive near the Goshen Springs exit, where you can see the Yazoo here, but then all these little white things are gypsum crystals. People at the Gem and Mineral Society probably know of this outcrop, but just a neat place if you've never been there. I will warn you, if you don't go there when it's wet. You will weigh about 20, 30 pounds more after you're finished. The Yazoo clay fails. This was a slope failure at Millsaps College campus. Although it gave us a great opportunity to teach students mapping and certain techniques, this wall failed because they didn't do the proper the company they hired didn't do the proper engineering up front. But again, these are quite frequent in the Yazoo clay. They happen along the interstates many times. I know at the police training grounds near McDowell Road, there's several down there. Now, these don't show up in the book, but I want to show you these. Again, foundation problems. This is Delo Water Park, and of course we do have some rapids. We have some water, as Daryl showed you, waterfalls. Those show up in the book, mostly because of some of the most recent. This is Owens Creek off the trace. Again, we've got a small waterfall. It does fail quite frequently. You can see this is the edge of the parking lot. That's the shadow from the fence that keeps people from going here. I don't know. It was closed the last time I was there, but I don't know what they're going to do because it's going to keep working itself backwards. And then finally, the Pleistocene. Interpretations based on what perhaps the Mississippi River did, the ancestral Mississippi River, what it looked like. I forget how many oxbow lakes I drew when I made this, but there's something like 500 of them. That was not a fun, but it's a beautiful, I love that figure. It really shows you can see where the Mississippi has had three major pathways down through the delta. One was close, the oldest was close to the bluff line. Then it took a central track, and then most recently, this is where the current meander belt exists. And so, again, I wanted to make sure that was in the book so that people could just see it at a glance, because unless you look at Google Earth or, you don't realize the complexity of the Mississippi Delta. What happened in the Pleistocene? Most people don't understand that sea level dropped some 400 feet, and the coastline of Mississippi was probably 90 to 100 miles offshore from where it is now. And so trying to come up with, looking at bathymetric contours and what would it look like if sea level dropped, that many feet. And here is about 22,000 years ago, this is a sea level curve. So you can see that somewhere around 440 feet or so is how low sea level got. And then, of course, over the last 10,000 years, sea level has been rising. This is just kind of an inset of that last 10,000 years and continues to rise right now. And again, we're trying to deal with the implications of that. Looking over towards Vicksburg, as Daryl said, these are engineering. These are called soil pins or soil nails that are put on the wall there at, is it Ameristar? One of the casinos, right there on the bluff. This is down in Natchez, where you can see this is Clifton Avenue that has receded considerably over the last any number of years. And I think I got a quote in the book. There was an engineer who did a report for the mayor of Natchez and says, this happened before, this will happen again, and it will fail. It's just a matter of when that will happen. Couldn't do a book about Mississippi without kudzu. That slope, that is an amazing slope. This is down in Port Gibson on the way to the Natchez Trace Military Park. And that's a cool place to visit. But I had to get the kudzu in there. I also got some in Yazoo County as well. But just the ability of that, and that's why we brought it here, is to keep the slopes in place, and boy, does it work. And then you have to talk about the levees, pretty extensive discussion on why we have to keep building our levees bigger and bigger and bigger to retain even larger floods, and diagrams of the existing levee system. Little insets about oxbow lakes. I happen to love oxbow lakes. Did my doctoral research in this one. This is Sky Lake up in Humphreys County. You can actually walk out into the middle of this thing. There's a wonderful walkway and learn a little bit about bald cypress and oxbow lakes. Pardon me? Oh, okay, that's fine. And down in Vicksburg, again, little things that people don't know about, that you can actually go there and see these high water marks. If the levees had not failed in 1927, this is where the water would have been at Vicksburg. And so just interesting little things that kind of open people's eyes as to what's happening. We've got the longest beaches in the world, one of the longest natural or man-made, human-made engineered beaches in the world. I talk about the development of it and the fact that not just in Mississippi, but across the nation in coastal states, the issue now is nourishing these beaches, bringing the sand back and putting it in place. That's getting expensive. So there are many, many options on how you try to keep the sand in place. Finally, one of the last pictures, this was compliments of Dr. Fritz at Georgia Tech. And it still remains today the highest Atlantic basin high water mark was at the Beau Rivage Hotel, and it was at 34.1 feet, just right here. Is how high the wave got, and so that was that wasn't the greatest storm surge, but when you combine the storm surge with the tide and the wave height, it came up to 34.1 feet, which is the highest, again, that they've recorded during any hurricane in the area. And probably, I did not doctor this photo. If you haven't been to Red Bluff, you've got to go look at it. Truly one of the most beautiful places in terms of color in Mississippi. That's down in Marion County in Columbia, near Columbia, but just unbelievable. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Have anything to do with the Ohio River when it came to Mississippi?
We talk about, that's a little, when you start trying to pin down what was the ancestral Ohio, what was the ancestral Mississippi, and where they were, that's about as complex as we got. Identifying which channel was which. Oh yeah, some of the Oxbow Lake, and that's just it. So the editor had a hard time. What's an abandoned channel? What's an abandoned course? And it's just, a course is longer than a channel, and then of course we had the Oxbow Lakes, and just defining those terms for someone that's not used to it was hard. But again, we tried to use ancestral Ohio and Mississippi because there is evidence to show that the Ohio did come further down. Yeah, a little bit. Yes, George.
Has anyone expressed any interest in turning the book into a Roadside Geology of Mississippi app?
No. Well, my son is a freshman at Millsaps, and I've already told him that it's his job to do the second edition. So maybe that's something he can take up. But yeah, I don't know that anybody's done that with any of the Roadside series.
What's the most surprising thing that you found that you were not looking for?
I don't think I fully appreciated the complexity of the Mississippi Delta. And when I really started to delve into literature a little bit and actually had to draw some of those, again, it's also complexly interwoven. It's not readily observable from the surface. You drive across the Delta, it's flat, it's wet, but when you really start looking at it, the water is there for a reason. There are reasons why the catfish farms are where they are. There are reasons why they can plant rice where they do in the Delta, and it all relates to the Pleistocene glaciation. And so it's incredibly interwoven. And so, yeah, I think the Delta was probably my biggest surprise. I don't know, Daryl?
I'm going to finish with really interesting, the gumbo areas, like you say, where they have the catfish because it's clay, and then 65, 45 feet of good lows over here. It's really, it is interesting.
Yeah. Yes.
On that high water mark, I think there's some mathematic error on there. We had 22 and 11.11. I think that's 30.
There's a wave height.
Okay.
Yes, I didn't put the wave height in. There's like there you have a tide
Yeah.
and you have the storm surge,
Right.
but there was also like a 1 foot wave height.
Thank you.
Yes, that was it.
Okay.
There are, you know, again, the first time Dr. Musselman just walked in, we were on a field trip up crossing the Tennessee-Tom Bigby waterway, and he brought a copy of the book, and this was just after it came out. So I was being kind of cocky, and I said, hey, you guys want to know about it? I'll read it. It's in the book. So I started reading it, and I got to the very last line, and between when Daryl and I edited it and it went to the printer, somehow the last 5 words of the sentence dropped. So I'm reading along, and all of a sudden, I'm like, where'd it go? And so that was the first error that, well, the second one that I saw, but anyhow. I was upset, and they said, hey, don't worry. He said, first editions usually have about 20. I was like, thanks.
Yeah, one of my students had one before I had it, and also noted on the back it talks about the Jackson Dome near Jacksonville.
Yeah. And I asked him about it, and we didn't even edit that. And he said, oh, I just thought, you know. And I said, no, it's not right. So anyway, yeah, that was the first one I saw. The second one was the Tennessee-Tom Bigby waterway. But you get over that, and, you know.
I found a couple of other ones attributable to the after editing, but from what I understand, it's still turned out to be very minor compared to a lot of first editions. So. As academicians, we were kind of bummed about it, though.
Yeah.
While you're working on that app, a Roadside Geology of Mississippi coloring book.
Yes.
Would be great here at the museum.
Yeah. That would be an easy one to make, is the Roadside Geology coloring book. But yeah, the app, you got to get somebody more technical than me. somebody more.
To George's point, there's an app called Roadside America that's crowdsourced, and this stuff will naturally end up being added to it.
Okay.
People will discover it and add it.
There you go, George.
Did you guys use a particular, like the latest book as a model, and were you instructed by the publisher about which most recent book to use as a model? Or?
There had been a couple that were done in color. I think Maryland was a rewrite. Louisiana had just been done in color.
Yeah, Louisiana, I think.
Yeah, and so just really that was, once they said full color, it's like, okay, you know. Because I don't know how you would do a geologic map. They used to do them, obviously, but it was just, it was increased the workload probably 100 times, but the end publication is certainly worth it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was very pleased. And again, I think I drove 10,000 miles or more just retaking pictures. And they just said, well, this one's not good enough. I was like, it's 5 megabytes. How could it not be a good picture? And I had to go back and take it again, you know. But that was frustrating. Yes.
I know y'all are stopping on the rights of way. Are there any problems with that? Are people, any problems?
No, because, if there was an outcrop in someone's backyard, we didn't put it in. But no, all the pictures are taken from the road, or, again, a picture from the petrified forest, you have to get their permission. When you go to the military parks and stuff like that, they signed off. But there's no private property on there.
Toughest one to get was an outcrop in the riverbed of I think it's the Bowie River there at Hattiesburg. So there was so much traffic on I-59, and we came up with a scheme at one point to get a school bus and just stop it on the road, but that didn't work.
Yeah, I didn't retake that one. I said, because I was there with my wife, I said, how did he take this picture? Because there's nowhere to pull over.
There's not.
And I said, forget it.
I'll tell you how I did it. I caught it after they mowed, and I stopped and walked back down on the bridge.
Okay.
And did not find any dead bodies, thank goodness.
Certainly appreciate you coming. Yeah.
And Dr. Galik, very good. And remember, they have a book out there, so you might want to get on with that book at some point. Next month, we have Dr. Will Sullivan from Millsaps, and he'll be talking about coastal bird conservation, local habitat conservation, based on his time in Louisiana. So please come back for that. Good to see everybody. Thank you.